The year is 1935. This is the decade of the Great Depression when banks were failing left and right, unemployment was skyrocketing and people were struggling just to get by. This is also the time when the mob was at its peak and corruption was running rampant throughout the country. So imagine living in that time period and checking into a fancy city hotel, asking for a room away from any prying eyes, preferably without any windows. That's exactly what happened in the case of our next victim. He checked into the hotel on January 2nd, 1935, arriving around 10 p.m., but he wasn't alone. He had two companions with him, although police would never find them or even know their names. The only name they knew was his. It was the only thing he had given them. He gave the clerk his name, Roland T. Owen, but that wasn't his real name. He didn't have any identification on him either. No driver's license, no passport, nothing. He also didn't have any luggage or bags, nothing but the clothes on his back. So if he didn't have a name, no ID, and no luggage, where was he coming from, and more importantly, where was he going? Unfortunately, we'll never know. All we know is, he requested a room away from everyone, preferably with no windows, saying he was expecting someone to visit him, but nobody ever came. All he got was room 1046, a narrow space with one door, one window, which was boarded shut, and four walls, one of which was covered in blood. When he first checked in, the man was well-groomed and wearing a suit, but within hours he was pacing the length of his dark, narrow room like a caged animal. Staff at the hotel could hear him talking on the phone. "No, Don, I don't want to eat, I just want to think," he said quietly. But who was Don? Was he the person he was expecting to meet at the hotel? Was he alone? He must have spent a lot of time on the phone because staff saw him enter the room at 10 p.m. and then again at midnight, both times carrying food with him. But each time he would return to his room, he would sit in the darkness and stare straight ahead of him. According to the night auditor, he sat there for hours watching the door. He ordered more water but made it clear he didn't want anyone to tell Don. "Don't tell Don I had anything," he told the staff. But who was Don? A few days after checking in, a bellboy knocked on the door of room 1046. He wanted to check if Mr. Owen needed anything else. There was no answer, so he tried again. Still nothing. Thinking maybe Mr. Owen had forgotten to lock his door, the bellboy opened it, expecting to see the man sitting in the room. But instead, he saw a pair of feet with ankles bound together lying in the corner of the room. Then he noticed more blood on the floor. At first he thought it was paint, but it wasn't. It was real blood. In a panic, the bellboy ran for help, and soon the entire floor was swarming with police. They rushed into the room and found a man tied up in the corner. He was barely breathing and covered in blood. He had been beaten badly and stabbed several times in the chest. Despite their best efforts, the man was dead. It took some time for the police to identify him, as he had given them a false name and had no ID on him. Plus, there weren't many identifying features on him. He was white, probably in his early 20s and about 5'9". They found blood-stained clothes in the bathroom, but nothing else. No weapon, no signs of a struggle, not even a set of fingerprints. Even his face had been washed, though it didn't do a good job of covering up the fact that he'd been beaten. While the police were able to piece together what had happened, they weren't able to figure out who he was or why he'd been attacked. He had been brought to the hospital already dead. There were no witnesses to the crime, and no one had seen him leave the hotel. After 3 weeks of searching and with no leads, the case went cold. But here's the kicker. The fingerprints didn't match any known criminals. And after checking missing persons reports across the country, they finally found a match. But it wasn't a missing persons report. It was a runaway report. His real name was Artemis Ogletree, 17 years old, and he'd run away from home in Alabama 6 months prior. So who was this kid hanging around with dangerous people? What was he doing in a dingy hotel on the wrong side of town? Why did he give the police a fake name and travel without identification? And most importantly, who was Don? As the police continued their investigation, they learned that Artemis had quite a criminal history for such a young man, having been arrested for petty theft several times. But he always maintained his innocence, claiming he'd never stolen anything in his life. To make matters worse, while searching his belongings, The police found a note addressed to Don, but it contained nothing but numbers, which didn't match any known addresses or phone numbers. Aside from that note, they found a receipt for a bus ticket from Alabama to Kansas City, Missouri. And that was it. There were no clues as to why Artemis had come to the hotel or why he had asked not to be disturbed. With no leads, the case went cold once again, and years turned into decades with Artemis's murder remaining unsolved. In the following months, police received calls from all over the country claiming to have seen the boy, but every lead went nowhere. To this day, they don't know why he used a false name, why he came to the hotel, or who Don was. However, they did manage to find out one very strange thing about the case. The manager of the hotel told police that room 1046 didn't exist. Sure, the room was located on the floor above, but that floor wasn't numbered. In fact, there was no record of it ever being occupied, leading police to believe that Artemis was murdered in the wrong place. According to the manager, there had never been a room 1046. It was only used for storage, but this wasn't the only oddity of the case. On March 1935, exactly 1 month after Artemis was found dead in the hotel room, a maid went to clean room 1046. When she knocked on the door, she noticed the phone was off the hook. Concerned, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty. There was blood everywhere, covering the walls, the door, and the curtains. It looked like someone had slaughtered the boy in cold blood and wiped the walls clean of evidence. She screamed for help and police rushed to the scene. But there was nothing they could do. The killer had vanished. But why? Had he left the room? Had he moved the body somewhere else? Or had he simply made it disappear? For years, people stayed away from the room, fearing it was cursed or haunted. But eventually it was cleaned and the room was put back into service. However, according to guests, the new room number, 1018, seemed to be cursed. Shortly after the first guest checked in, they heard the sound of screams and footsteps in the middle of the night, followed by the sound of a door slamming. After that, the guest checked out immediately. For the next few years, no one would stay in the room. But in 1984, it was given a new number, 913. And since then, people have happily stayed in the room with no reported paranormal activity. But one question still remains: who was Don? Was he the reason for Artemis's death, and if so, why? Did the police find any clues as to who he was? Well, yes, but they didn't realize it until much later. Months after the incident, a woman called the funeral home requesting that they dig up the body. "Don't bury him in a pauper's grave," she said. "He had a mother who loved him." She sent flowers and a generous donation to pay for the funeral, but she never gave her name. Years later, a detective found a woman who matched her description and asked her about the case. She denied knowing anything about it and refused to cooperate with the police. However, the same woman sent roses to the funeral home every year on the anniversary of Artemis's death for the next 50 years. But who was she, and why did she send those roses? Was she the only one who cared about Artemis? Or was she somehow involved in his death? There are several theories surrounding this case. Some say Artemis was a mobster who was killed by his own gang. Others claim he was involved in a love triangle and was killed by the jealous lover. Some even go as far as to say he was the victim of a satanic ritual gone wrong. But we may never know the truth. Unfortunately, the only clue that could have solved the case was lost forever when the killer wiped the blood off the walls of room 1046. Now watch. Real-life serial killers who are still on the loose, or have you met a ghost? True scary stories.